Okay.
Welcome everybody to the Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods seminar series. We're getting down to the end of our year. Just want to remind you all that this is a monthly seminar. Please tell your friends and family. Interesting topics. The schedule is outside. It's also on the website. We have 3 more for the rest of this year. In May, we have Megan Holmes coming. If those of you who don't know, there's a new center on campus called the Center for Trauma and Adversity. And she's coming to talk about innovating beyond violence exposure and PTSD. That'll be on May 8th. On June 12th, my daughter's birthday, Saran Karukian is coming to talk about the opioid epidemic in Ohio. And then on the 10th is Colleen Walsh, who, sorry, go back a little bit. So Saran Karukian is a faculty member in the Department of Population and Quantitative Health Sciences. And then Colleen Walsh, who has been a research associate at the PRC and is now an assistant professor at Cleveland State, is coming to talk about a study on health equity study that she and a colleague have been doing. So please put these in your calendar. All right. Is there any other to-do things I need to mention? Okay. All right. Well, this is a great pleasure. And I loved it. When I walked up, Erika just said, I really love this project. So I am very pleased to introduce, like I need to introduce her, but Dr. Erika Trapl, who is the Associate Director at our PRC, an Associate Professor in the Department of Population and Quantitative Health Sciences, and is the newly co-lead, they're just adding things onto her plate, of the, I also have to make sure I've got it right, the Cancer Prevention, Control, and Population Research Program within the Cancer Center. So I'm very excited. I think a lot of you know this is really a topic that many of us in the PRC have become very passionate about. And I think Erika has provided an incredible foundation for us to go. And we're going to hear a lot about that today. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I appreciate the introduction, Elaine. And I am very excited to talk about this particular project. It had been developed in many iterations and until it finally landed on this one. And none of what you're going to see today would have been possible without all of the partners on this slide. So Dr. Monica Webb-Hooper, who was one of my co-investigators, Dr. Sarah Koopman-Gonzalez, who was the overall manager but also a co-investigator, Erika Hood, who was previously here and has since moved on to Metro, a number of our interns who helped with all sorts of things, and most importantly, our community organization and resident partners. And this project in particular, this iteration, this version was funded by the Ohio Department of Health, their Tobacco Disparities Demonstration Program. And when we received it, it was a 12-month grant, 12-month contract, so you'll kind of see what we were able to do with a little bit more than 12 months. Okay. So if you've been to one of our seminars that's anything about tobacco, or if you've read anything that we've put out from the Center about tobacco, these numbers are not new to you. We conducted a behavioral risk factor surveillance system survey in 2014-15 in the city of Cleveland, where we were able to document that there's a little bit of a formatting. So we were able to to document that current cigarette smoking rate in the city of Cleveland is 35%. That's nearly double what it is in Cuyahoga County, and more than double what it is in the United States. If you look at all tobacco products, so all combustible products in addition to cigarettes, we actually get closer to 39%. These are extremely, extremely high rates of smoking. When we look at this by income level, we see a little bit of variation, and we see the highest rates of smoking in our lowest income residents, with nearly 45% of residents with income levels of under $25,000 a year reporting current tobacco use. And that you'll see it declines as income increases, but still, even at salaries above $50,000, we are still well above the national, state, and county prevalence of smoking within the city of Cleveland. I will also add that our smoking population demographically is predominantly male, more male than female. Whites and blacks in the city of Cleveland smoke at similar rates, around 40%, and those under 55 smoke at much higher rates than those over 55. And we see a similar distribution by college education, but this is really the most pronounced way to kind of look at smoking by income. So sometimes folks will say, well, smokers don't want to quit, and particularly low-income smokers. If there are so many of them, certainly it's because they don't want to quit. And our data actually shows that that's not the case. In fact, 68%, over 2/3 of smokers intend to quit in the next 6 months. That's actually quite high. And what you'll see is over half of them intend to quit in the next 30 days. And among smokers, what we see is that about 6% have called the Quitline. Now, for Quitline, this is actually quite good. But you can see that even for 53% who want to quit, there's still a huge gap in that 5 or 6% to the 53% who want to quit. Now, these numbers don't actually perhaps vary in the way that you might think. When we look at this by income level, what we see is that it is actually the lower income folks who have a greater interest in quitting in the next 30 days. So we have high rates of quitting, high levels of interest in quitting. So what's happening here? Why aren't folks quitting? So what do we know about cessation in low-income populations? We know quite a bit. We know that the Quitline is effective broadly and that this also works within low-income populations. We know that individual and group counseling is effective, and this approach also works within low-income populations. We know that pharmacotherapy is effective. So this is nicotine replacement or Chantix. This is also effective in low-income populations. And we're learning more about the effectiveness of text messaging quit programs. Our colleague, Dr. Monica Webb-Hooper, presented on this last month. And their acceptability among low-income populations and other populations, and that there's a building evidence base for the use of these products, for these approaches. So then we have to ask ourselves, if we know that these approaches exist, and we know that they work, why are we having so much difficulty scaling them up? Are we having difficulty scaling them up, or are we not necessarily implementing them in ways that are easily accessible for those who need and want them? So that was really what led our research team to this project, thinking about ways that we could take these evidence-based strategies and make them more accessible in ways that low-income smokers could access them and utilize them successfully. So we proposed an intervention to the Ohio Department of Health, and we said, this is what we think we're going to do. We're following the evidence in the community guide. For those of you who are not familiar with the community guide, I encourage you to check it out. It's thecommunityguide.org. It has the evidence, the collected evidence for community-based approaches to prevention in a lot of different areas. And under tobacco, it says these are the things that work. Media campaigns, adoption of 100% tobacco-free campuses and other types of tobacco-free policies, as well as promotion of cessation resources. What we wanted to do was flip this a little bit and say, let's take a very community-heavy approach as opposed to a clinically heavy approach. A lot of discussion is around brief interventions in clinical settings, talking to your physician, physician advice, referral to the Quitline via clinical encounter. We wanted to say, that's great, but how often are folks really going to the doctor, and can we complement that with some messaging and other things that are happening in their neighborhoods? And not only did we follow the community guide, but key to this intervention development, and why I have it in caps, is that we were doing this in partnership with our community resident partner experts. So what does that really look like? What does that mean? It does not mean that I invited them to a meeting, talked at them, sent them on their way, and said, I've checked that box. No, it was a very intentional engagement. So we said, we have some ideas, but we're not the experts in your communities. We already had some relationships in a few East Side neighborhoods through a previous project, so we had some resident expert partners that we've been working with, and we said, we have this opportunity to do a tobacco project. Is that something that might resonate? Resounding yes, let's do it. Bring this to our neighborhood, to our community. We said, okay, great. We think we have some ideas. We think we see a lot of folks who are under 55. This is probably folks with children, families. Maybe this tells us where we might look in neighborhoods and in communities for intervention points. So which community organizations, which type of organizations do you, community residents, think are most impactful in your community, where people gather? We wanted them to look at the media campaign materials we were looking at. The CDC has developed a very effective campaign called the TIPS campaign. One of the more recognizable visible is Terry. She had a trach and was one of the early ads, was very, very effective. And this was a campaign that actually shifted away from talking about death and the risk of death and talked about the loss of quality of life. And so these ads have been tested substantially. They've been updated every year with new additions, and so we wanted residents to look at those ads and help us identify which ones might resonate in their community. And then we asked them, what is the best way to share cessation resources? I think the first time I wrote this grant and this idea, I said, we're going to create a website. It's going to be great. We didn't do that, don't worry. So when we met with them, they said, okay, here's where we think families are. Libraries, daycares, and churches. We have a lot of those in our communities. Why don't we start there? Those are the places we think you should go. We said, okay, that sounds great. We're going to do an organizational readiness assessment with all of those institutions in your 3 neighborhoods. We're going to ask them if they do anything around offering cessation resources. We're going to ask them if they have tobacco policies in their organizations. We're going to ask them if they're interested in that. And so the next thing was, okay, we need a project name. We don't want to name it, but let's hear your ideas. And they said, don't make it scary. We don't want this to be about scary. We want something that gives us hope. We want something that gives us a sense of community, that is very community-oriented. And they actually landed on We Share Air before they got to Breathe Free. But this is kind of an abstract lung in kind of lighter, airier colors. And so this was the mark that they wanted us to use to kind of recognize the project and our materials going forward. So after we identified the selection of the media ads from the TIPS campaign, they picked a couple. One I'll show you that depicts a scar. One that's actually of a young boy with asthma in the emergency room to really promote the idea that the secondhand smoke is also impactful. We talked with them about the creation of radio ads. Through some other projects, we had a relationship with one of the local radio stations, and they said they would be willing to record some radio advertisement for us. We've done this in the past, great partnership with them. Talked to residents, okay, this DJ said he'll record. They're like, oh no, no. Because right before that ad about smoking, he's probably going to talk about alcohol or some other thing, and so people won't really buy into whatever he's talking about. They said, we want to hear from people like us. We want to hear from people who have gone through that quit experience and who are from our neighborhood and who know what we're going through. And we said, okay, where are we going to find those people? 2 people immediately raised their hands and said, we will gladly do it. And so we continue to ask them these kinds of questions, and I got to, all right, how do you want to learn about these resources? We're going to find everything we can for you. How would you like us to share it? Do you want it in a website? Do you want it in an app? No. So a lovely resident expert colleague who's usually here and who isn't here today said, you know, just have us call 211. That's what we already are used to doing anyway. They're good at that. And that's who we should call. You should just have us call 211. And it was like, you know, like the answer that I would never have gotten any other way if I hadn't been in that room at that time with those folks. So he said, okay, let's go call 211 and see what we can do. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with 211, but it is a first call for helpline that is run by the United Way of Greater Cleveland. Actually, about 98% of the United States is serviced by some 211 organization. 211 is a nationally designated line through the SEC, the communications people, who also designate 411 like the info line or 911. So across the country, all you have to do is dial that number, and you will go to your designated helpline. 211 is 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They have someone available. They typically provide social service supports, so things like emergency food assistance, help with utilities, help with transportation, help with housing. They have also in the past moved somewhat into health-related services. And the way that they do this is when you call, you are routed to a trained call specialist who then has a conversation with you. They take a little bit of information, but only information that helps them make referrals. Then they have a conversation with you about why you're calling, what your needs are, and they work through a very well-developed database to identify the services that would most help the caller in achieving whatever their call needs are. And they document what those call needs are. It is not unusual for someone to call with one need and receive a referral for another need. And that's what 211 wants to do. They want to give all the resources they can to help that person when they're on the call with the things that are the most urgent. And they regularly monitor those calls so that they can improve the way that they are serving their call base. So I called up the director at the time, Diane Gatto, who I said, okay, we have this idea, we're doing this project right now. Is this something we could do? She's like, yeah, let's get the team together and figure it out. And that was like one of the best, another great phone call and another wonderful experience. The folks at 211 are amazing. It's an amazing, amazing team. So when we got together with them, they explained their process, and they said, really what we need to do is develop that database. If you can help us get all the resources identified, that will allow us to put that into our system. We can figure out what you have. Once we've started, they have research librarians who actually maintain and update those databases on an ongoing basis. So every year those databases are updated. They also asked for additional information in certain areas, and we're able to look for that. So they wanted additional information specific to pharmacotherapy and managed care. They do have some prescription assistance programs that they offer as one of their healthcare services. So they were able to think about how to link those pieces together. We also had resident suggestions to co-refer stress management, which 211 was quite amenable to, but recognized that they were limited in their referrals because of the limitations of the services that are available in Cuyahoga County, truthfully. So once we did that, we said, okay, we want folks to call you. So we're going to make that our call to action, call 211. How do we do that? They gave us the call language for the media. They agreed to give us regular call reports so that we could see if we were actually generating calls to 211. And the process that they use to integrate this means that this cessation referral process is still happening right now. It's sustained beyond the life of the project because it's just part of how they do business now. In fact, this morning I called 211 just to see what would happen. It's tax season, so they have a recording. If you need help with your taxes, press 2. If you're calling for help to quit smoking or for cessation supports, press 3. Any other calls, push 5. So they're actually using their IVR system to elevate the presence of cessation supports to their callers. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so our media campaign, as I said, this directed all of our target population to call 211 for smoking cessation resources. These ads were created and reviewed by our resident teams. They were reviewed by United Way's 211 team so that everybody knew what was going out. We ran radio ads for 3 weeks. We used 2 different advertisements, Mr. Michael and Ms. Monica. And we had these on 3 different radio stations. So they were going fairly regularly across the greater Cleveland area. We also ran 4 weeks of bus advertisements. These were 2 modified CDC tips advertisements. I'll show you one on the next screen. And these are similar to what we created as posters. So here is one of the tips campaign ads. It says smoking causes immediate damage to your body. For net, it caused lung cancer. You can quit. And then the call to action, call 211 for help to quit smoking so that you can breathe free. So let me play one of our ads for you. Let's see. Is it going to play? Okay. I'm going to figure that out, and I will find another way to play it for you because I think Mr. Michael's 30-second ad is pretty darn amazing and pretty great. So our media campaign, again, was those bus ads, the radio ads, and then we were working with the organizations. So I mentioned we were thinking about daycares, libraries, and churches. So given that we were in the context of a 12-month grant cycle from the Ohio Department of Health, we said, okay, we think we really have about 8 weeks to work with each of our organizations in order to kind of see some longer term effect. So let's assume that we can work with them in 8 weeks. And what we're going to ask them to do is really 2 things. We're going to ask them to adopt a 100% tobacco-free campus policy, and we're going to ask them to promote 211 with the resources that we provide them. Now, for those of you less familiar who may be thinking, well, everything's already tobacco-free, we do have state laws that that prohibits smoking indoors, and that was all passed through our Clean Indoor Air Act many, many years ago. However, 100% tobacco-free campus policy means that there is no tobacco use allowed anywhere on the property, including outside, in the parking lot, or even in the vehicles that are owned by the organization. And this has actually been shown to shift the social norm away from smoking. It reduces the optics of those smoking. Now some say, well, people just cross the street, and that may happen, but there are changes that occur, and for some folks who just need that little push of, I can't just walk outside the door and smoke, that may be enough to kind of push them into being more likely to quit. To help the organizations do this, we provided them with an adapted template, which I'll show you in just a moment, to make it really relevant for them. There are a number of 100% tobacco-free campus toolkits that have a lot of language that our organizations told us was a little bit overwhelming and didn't really capture the reasons that they wanted to adopt the policy. And so they were encouraged to adapt that template to make it relevant to them. So, I don't know if you can read this, but I'll read it for you. So we said tobacco exposure at any level is harmful and unsafe for the community. Creating a tobacco-free environment can improve the lives of residents, especially children, protecting them from secondhand and third-hand smoke. Then we provided 3 options, and they could choose one or all or any. So parental smoking leads to several pregnancy problems and has caused the death of 100,000 babies in the last 50 years. That's one. As in contrast with the last one, the most recent Surgeon General's report cautions people against the use of all kinds of tobacco products, including e-cigarettes. So if they felt like any of those would really represent with the folks that they serve, they could choose those. And then we had these options. We at organization considered our shared responsibility as an organization to improve the health and well-being of our visitors as well as our neighborhood. So this goes back to that sense of community building and shared values. This is one that we wrote for daycare centers. At this daycare center, we encourage children to have good, healthy habits. We want to extend this vision to families as well, so as to promote good homes and environments. And then they could choose the language that really had meaning to them, as opposed to those wherefore, therefore, that we see in a lot of policy language. We also created materials that they could use after they adopted. Kelly?
Did you visit each daycare and communicate this with them, or did you have a person who was
Yes, I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Yes. So from that first staff team slide, I mentioned Erika Hood, who was our implementation specialist. She and our intern team were really the point people working with each of these organizations. Yeah. So we created these pieces as both clings and yard signs so that the organizations could promote that they had adopted this policy. Depending on where the building was actually physically located, sometimes a yard sign was easier, sometimes a cling on the door was easier. We offered both so that folks could advertise what made sense the most. We also offered them communication statements. So we said, if you're going to be communicating with your constituents, the people you serve, or the employees in your organization, here's some things that you can use or adapt that will help you to communicate why you've adopted this policy and how you're implementing it. So the detail's not too important here, but it's just messages about 100% tobacco-free campus. And these are short paragraphs. We also had some tweets. We also had Facebook posts or things that they could include in their newsletters in anticipation of them potentially wanting to communicate those changes. Again, we also developed the materials to promote 211 that would go into those organizations. So we used a lot of the same advertising that we used on the buses. Our residents told us, and our organizational partners said, we want some youth-oriented pieces. We want family-friendly material. We're a daycare. We don't need to have, really scary images for our families. And we need different sizes because we have different spaces where we can put these materials. So some of these we actually developed in collaboration with Emory University, who has developed some similar kinds of materials. So we wound up developing the one on the far left for kind of our younger folks. This is an info poster about cigar products. So any of you who've seen me talk before know that I also love cigars, meaning I love to research them, not use them. And we felt it was really important in the neighborhoods that we were working in, as well as our residents, not just talk about smoking these cigarettes, but to talk about it as these other products as well. So this really just talks about some of the misconceptions. So are cigar products dangerous to your health? Is secondhand smoke from cigar products safer? And how else can cigar products harm children? So these are typically the areas where people say, oh, they're safer, they're not as harmful, they're more natural. And so we just try to address that, and that was a very popular product. We also created this piece on the right, again using, we would have preferred to have images of some of our residents, but our time was working against us, so we had their help in choosing some stock images. I think going forward we would choose images of folks from our community. But again, has the same kind of call 211 to help people to quit now, the breathe free mark, something optimistic, positive. These were done as posters and also as palm cards, so small postcard sizes that they could distribute. Libraries particularly said, what can you give us that we can put on our resource table that people can take? Other organizations said, we don't have a resource table, so what do you have that I can stick on the wall? And so we looked to be flexible in how we delivered those messages so that it would meet the needs of the organizations. So what happened? So I'm going to talk about a couple of pieces of data collection that we did. We had a lot of data collection. I think this is the epidemiologist in me. I just want to collect information about everything. I want to know everything. And I have a team who also aims to please me and collect as much data as possible. So today I'm going to talk about the organizational readiness results and how that led to the groups that we worked with, our policy implementation pieces, and then our call data from 211. So I mentioned we worked with 3 communities. Within those 3 communities, we worked with Google and our residents to identify 76 churches, 36 daycares, and 4 libraries that served those 3 communities. We contacted everyone at least 5 times to ask for their participation in our organizational readiness assessment. It was a brief over-the-phone 5-minute call to ask and find out if they already had a policy in place, what sort of policy they had in place, if it was in writing, and if they were interested in participating or adopting a policy and receiving resources. So what you can see is that we had less than half of our organizations complete the assessment. We had the most difficulty reaching churches and daycares, predominantly because in daycares we had some turnover in staffing that made it hard, plus just the time of the day and their responsibilities made it hard at times to respond. Also churches, despite us actually going to churches on weekends to try to catch folks, it was hard to find the right person to talk to. However, we got 54 and we were really excited about that. Most of these organizations already had some sort of policy about smoking. However, of those, just over half actually had 100% tobacco-free campus policy. So there was opportunity for some improvement here. 13 organizations indicated to us that they were that they did not currently have tobacco-free campus policy, but were interested. And most of the organizations, over 80%, said that they would be interested in providing resources to their constituents, to the folks that they served. So from that pool, we selected 12 organizations, or invited 12 organizations to actually participate in our project. We worked with 3 libraries, 5 daycares, and 4 churches. We were actually hoping to get 6 daycares and 6 churches, but again, just had some difficulty in identifying folks to work with, particularly within the, again, 12-month time frame of our project, which did require us to move along a bit. Of those 12, 4 actually adopted and implemented 100% tobacco-free policy within the 8 weeks that we were working with them. 1 had been in process and at this point has now adopted, so we had 5 of our 12 organizations actually adopt and implement 100% tobacco-free policy. At our last check-in, I think almost all of them were still displaying a window cling or some acknowledgement of their policy. 6 encountered institutional barriers. These, not surprisingly, were the libraries and the daycares that were part of a larger system. In the context of this project, we didn't have the resources to work with the larger system to assist them in making those changes, but clearly there are opportunities to work with the centers who coordinate several of these daycares, as well as the Cleveland Public Library system, to have those policies implemented throughout their system and have a larger impact. Only 1 opted against the policy, and they felt that it would be not well received by their constituents, and they decided not to pursue the policy at that time. They all still took the resource materials, though, and we're quite happy to do that. here, I just wanted to show, I mentioned that we had different kinds of materials, and folks took different things to communicate that policy change. Some wanted both and had the space to do it, some did not. So having the flexibility to be responsive to their communication needs was very helpful and much appreciated by the organizations. However, none of them used the communication statements. So we had them, but they felt that they didn't need those and that they weren't, some said they just didn't communicate with their folks in those ways. And that this seemed, the cling and the yard sign really seemed to just convey the message clearly enough. Okay. Each of the organizations we worked with posted at least one of these media materials. And keep in mind, all of those had the call to action of call 211 for cessation support. So that was great to know that they were all doing what we wanted them to do as an organization, which was promote 211 and cessation, in addition to their policy pieces. And as I mentioned, one did not want to communicate because they didn't communicate with constituents in that way. Oh, but one church did use. That's opposite.
The policy there are two separate types of communication.
Oh, that's right.
One for policy, if they adopted the policy, and one for promoting 211.
That's right.
They used the ones promoting 211.
We gave them lots of stuff, and we kept track of everything. Okay, so we talked to organizations after and said, what could we do better? What helped? What could we have done? The first thing, and there you go, give them some adhesive. Give them a way to hang the posters up on the wall. Well, we'll be doing that from now on. Who would have thought that a 99-cent, thing of tape would make that big of a difference? But it does. So we'll be doing that from now on. Others did still mention limited space, and so thought maybe easels would provide additional space. So that's something to consider. Being thoughtful about how organizations are able to use space and what they use them for. And then there was a suggested. There was also suggestions from the organizations who wanted us to have people come to them. So our involvement in this implementation was really to have our staff say, we want to help you adopt the policy. How can we help you with that? Here's the language. We'll walk you through the template. I think at times we were even filling it out in Word for them because sometimes there were technology challenges. And so we worked with them, we prepared it for them, and we brought it back to them. We did not have capacity to do things like health fairs or to be on site to meet with their folks or to do presentations with their teams. So it was really limited to working with the organization itself to help the organization provide information to their constituents. Okay. So I said we collected a lot of data. One of the things that we wanted to do was actually look for how folks who were engaged in those organizations may have been impacted by the intervention. So I've been calling them constituents. I just consider these the people who are served by either those churches, daycares, or libraries. So we enrolled a cohort of 210 folks. Not surprisingly, it was most difficult to retain the folks who were recruited from a library because you're not going to a library as frequently as you are likely going to daycare to drop off your child or to church to worship. So our follow-up rates were slightly impacted by this. But what I wanted to show you is that we did still have, even at time 4 and time 5, so time 4 was immediately after the organizational intervention, and then time 5 was 4 weeks after that. So we had about just over 2/3 of folks who were continuing to regularly go to that institution, to that organization. Of those, almost all knew that their organization had a policy about smoking, right? So that was one of our goals, was to increase awareness about smoking policy. And of those who went to the organization, half at time 4 and just over 1/3 said that their organization gave them a card with information about smoking. So they were receiving those resources. So that was a little bit of confirmation from the constituent side. We also knew from asking folks, we wanted to see, okay, this was, time 2 was right after our media campaign, right? So we had all those bus ads. Time 4 again was after that 8-week intervention with the organizations where they were putting up posters and adopting 100% tobacco-free policies. So we saw that initially only about 5% of folks had called 211 right after the media campaign. That increased to 11% right after we had that policy and poster intervention, and then settled back down to around 7% 4 weeks later. So kind of low, but not necessarily a bad thing to have folks calling. Of those, 20 and 25% respectively called 211 about tobacco. So these are folks who are calling even for other reasons, but at least these folks were calling specifically. And then what I thought was actually really great is that consistently about 12% of folks were encouraging other people to call 211. So we didn't have a particularly high smoking rate in this group. The churches particularly had very low smoking rates, but they always wanted to tell us stories. Oh, my mother. Oh, my son. Oh, this. And that was just amazing, the things they wanted. So they always knew people that they wanted to share the information with. And this is another benefit of these kind of community-based, multi-level interventions, is that you're changing norms and you're reaching out through people's social networks. But the real question that we had is, okay, you tell us they're calling, but does 211 know? Will they actually call 211? They called a lot. So the orange on the left is calls to 211 for smoking cessation prior to our media intervention. The blue bars are when we started our radio and bus ads. These are calls per week. So you can see that from June, the first week of June 2017 through the end of October 2017, in those 5 months they had 22 total calls for cessation. And then the calls kept going, and you see variability. I'll tell you right here, January, this is a big spike because this is typically when people make their New Year's resolutions, right? But it continued, okay? This was thrilling to me, but also really quite thrilling to 211. And I'm pretty lucky that they're big data geeks just like me. And so we got to looking at this in all sorts of ways. So in this limited time period that we had the grant, we had 148 calls for smoking cessation to 211. So this is from November of 17 to May of 18. That's not even a year, okay? Of those, now if you remember back in the beginning, I said there are a couple of evidence-based approaches to cessation. One of those is the Quitline. When the call specialists talked to the callers about what referrals they wanted, only 2/3 of callers accepted or requested a referral to the Quitline. That meant that the other third of people felt like the Quitline wasn't the right sort of cessation strategy for them. Okay? So that's big, because in tobacco cessation, we are always looking to push the Quitline, right? It's cheap, it works, but at least in this low-income group that's calling 211, this is not a solution that they feel like works for them. We had 196 referrals. That means of those 148 folks who called, many of them took more than one referral. This is great. We want people to have access to all of their options and to be able to try them out. We were particularly excited about a product called Smoke-Free Text. It was created by the National Cancer Institute. It's a free text-to-quit program. We had very little uptake on this, but what I will say is the referral process from 211 means that they go through the options, they give you what the options are, and then the caller has to follow up. Okay? So while they got these referrals, they may not have actually utilized them, but the text-to-quit option was not very popular in this group of callers. Over half of our callers got more than one cessation referral, and more than half got a cessation referral and a referral for another service or another need.
So when they call,
Yes.
is the 13, would they say, would the person answering the phone say, would you like information on smoke-free text? And then if they say they would, that's part of that 13, I suppose. And if they say yes, they would.
So this 13 is, yes, who accepted a referral to smoke-free text. So we're actually working through the process for us as researchers to listen to the call, because it is much more of a conversation than a checklist, as how we understand 211. So they're really trying to elicit need as opposed to moving through a checklist. We know that these resources are kind of organized by location, so that if there's something place-based that's relevant to the caller, we can do that. We know that oftentimes they may also be based on other characteristics like Medicaid. If you have Medicaid, you qualify for different services, and so they'll do that. And so they use that to kind of populate the set of options, and then they kind of go through some of the decision-making process with the caller, and then they kind of determine, does caller want any of these, and then they offer them. And that's the final disposition. So what we were particularly interested in, because we know that low-income smokers have particularly challenging barriers that are different than other smokers when it comes to quit, we were particularly interested in this group of folks who got other non-cessation related referrals. And again, those data geeks who are my best pals over at 2-in-1 were able to pull that out and tell us what were the other referrals that folks got. So the number one referral in that group was 19 co-occurring referrals for food pantries. So emergency food assistance. The next one is for eating disorder treatment, smoking addiction support groups, domestic violence hotlines. This one really worried them. And as a result of this, they've done their own kind of internal understanding of why are folks calling for cessation and then also asking for domestic violence assistance, right? What's going on there? So you can see it keeps going down. Housing, medication assistance, rent payment assistance, outpatient drug detox, inpatient drug detox, job finding assistance, baby clothing, opioid detox, lots of stuff. So that when you begin to think, well, why is it so hard for low-income smokers to quit? We've got all these co-occurring things, right? And what I'm excited about is when those folks called, they were able to potentially get connected to other resources that helped them with those pieces. So I'm also very pleased to tell you all that even though I showed you May, the calls have continued. And they continue to continue. So this is through December. We ended December with 21. I just got the report for March. We had 28. I think we had 28 calls in March. So we continue to have a fairly healthy volume considering the very minimal resources we have implemented in promoting this. Now, one thing that I will acknowledge wholly is that when we look at the map, and I don't have one of these up here, I'm sorry, they actually map out by zip code. So we can see in the entire county where people are calling from. We have a substantially high volume of calls from the 44102 zip code area, which is on the west side. That zip code also happens to be one of the top calling zip codes to 2-in-1, and it's a zip code that we didn't advertise for. We had the radio ads and the bus ads, but our organizations were all on the east side, far east side. So you may have remember me mentioning if you call 2-in-1, you could call right now if you wanted. It'll say press 2 for taxes, press 3 for cessation. It is entirely possible that just by 2-in-1 changing that IVR process, they have advertised it more widely to their callers. And their callers often call more than once. They're not just one time. It's a trusted resource. If they hear that, they may be thinking, I can call again in the future. So we're hoping to get access to this data so that we can begin to look at it because we have so many questions. As a caller, what's the call experience like? We don't know. And we know that not only us, but also 2-in-1 wants to make that the best possible caller experience that they can. What's happening in a call when cessation is a co-occurring referral? For those domestic violence calls, for those food assistance calls, what is the context of that conversation that those things kind of emerge? There's a lot of literature emerging right now in co-occurrence of food insecurity and smoking, and I think our data certainly points to that happening here. We don't know if callers actually utilize the referrals. I do know anecdotally because Dr. Monica Webb-Hooper has a lab right over here, and she has said to me, you know, somebody told me they got my information from 2-in-1. I'm like, yes, it's working. But you're an N of 1, I don't know, and we need to know, right? Because it's great to get folks at 2-in-1, but if we don't actually get them to those services, then we haven't solved the whole problem. Are those cessation supports actually meeting the needs of callers? We know that only 2/3 are taking the Quitline. Everybody got something. We know that we have no callers whose needs were not met. So everybody got something, but we don't know if once they tried it out, if that actually met their needs or if they have different kinds of needs for cessation. And then lastly, you know, can we manipulate how we push people to 2-in-1, but also pull those callers through to actually engage in cessation. So I mentioned the IVR where you can push 3 for cessation. That kind of prompts people to do that. We're also exploring the possibility of proactive referrals. So once somebody calls and said, I want to do the Quitline, could 211 actually forward their information to the Quitline, and then the Quitline calls that caller back? So they're kind of already in the process of addressing the enrollment, so they're in, and they don't have to take that additional step of calling. Or enroll them in the Text to Quit program. Does that actually help get more folks into that evidence-based strategy, and does it help them to be more successful? This is just the short list of questions. You can imagine we have tons more, and I hope maybe you have a few as well. So in summary, I think what we're learning from this project is that tobacco control interventions really must reach people and be meaningful in their everyday lives. I tend to think that this 2-in-1 approach has been fairly successful because it's in the context of their everyday lives. It's something they're already doing. It's not something that's just about smoking, but it's in the larger context. And certainly, in this case, the authentic partnership from the very beginning of the work has been the best way, I think, to make this meaningful and lasting community change, and to establish a partnership with 2-in-1 that I would not have had if it hadn't been for that resident team meeting a couple of years back. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions. Elizabeth.
So I'm really interested in this, and I'm interested in when people call, they request for the smoking cessation, they were connected to 2-in-1. I know you said it was more like a conversation. So was there an actual protocol for, first you offer referrals to the Quitline, if they don't want that, then
no, there's no protocol. It is they use their protocol of their approach to conversation to elicit needs. So we did not say do this, this, and this. That's partly why we want to kind of code out the calls, because we're curious to see if there are different styles of communication, or how the call specialists are eliciting those needs. Our goal would be to scale this up to the other 2-in-1s across the country, and so I think this is a really important part to understand, and also to see if we can learn from other types of brief interventions that do have some of this tailoring to it, that have been shown to be fairly effective at getting folks to the right kind of intervention. But before we do that, I think we need to understand what 2-in-1 does, and then understand if there's some space to make some suggestions around brief counseling that would be in alignment with their values.
So of the 65% or so who were referred to the Quitline,
right,
the other 37%, we know got some sort of
yes
help, but we don't really know how that was broken down. Well, we know the smoke text.
I do. I just didn't show it here.
Oh, okay.
So this was a shortened table. So so in addition to the Quitline, the smoke-free text, we had an option to go to National Cancer Institute also offers a free app, which is called Quit Start, which we were offering. I don't think we had any takers on that one. And NCI was actually counting on there, and they had given us special codes for enrollment, and they had no enrollments from the Cleveland area. We also have partners at the Cleveland Clinic and at Metro who offer free group counseling, and I believe the clinic may also offer free individual counseling programs with NRT to anyone, regardless of insurance status. And Dr. Webb Hooper has a lab here that provides free cognitive behavioral therapy to folks who participate in her lab. There may be a handful of others. We, again, worked with the Breathe Free Committee of Healthy Cleveland to ask them to make sure that our resources were comprehensive. We were looking predominantly for free evidence-based approaches. Mm-hmm. Kelly.
Did you notice of those folks who were referred to the Quitline, did the Quitline have an increase in calls?
We are still negotiating with the Ohio Department of Health to secure the Quitline data. There have been we have approval from them to receive the data, but there have been some staff changes that have precluded us from getting that data. That's something that we're hoping to look at to see if there was an uptick, particularly in the zip codes of Cleveland during the time of our advertisement that perhaps could be attributed to our work.
Nice.
Yeah. Yes.
Since your data showed a lot of smoking in younger people, and we also know that it's more difficult to quit with people who start smoking younger, have you considered for a future project working with high schools?
Honestly, no. Because my personal belief is that there are some policy changes that would likely be a little bit more effective at reducing youth access and youth use that we aren't currently doing as some cities, as a state and across the country, that are likely to have a bigger impact than school-based prevention. I don't discount it, but I also recognize the difficulties of working within the school context and the extent to which it is so difficult to take time away from instruction for things like tobacco prevention. I tend to think that if we are working in coalitions that engage youth and raise that awareness outside of the school context, we may be more impactful in making some changes. But the policies I'm thinking of are Tobacco 21, which we've had in Cleveland, and our center has actually documented some decline in tobacco use among our high school youth over the last 2 years since its implementation. I know a handful of other cities are looking at that, and actually the state of Ohio is considering that policy in its current budget. And that would be quite a coup. And I think it is impactful. I think there are things that we could do as a state around tobacco tax equity that would make our less expensive non-cigarette tobacco products a bit out of reach. I know that there are concerns about taxes and the impact of those, but I think they're particularly impactful for youth. And I think we need to continue to encourage broader campaigns such as the ones that the FDA is now launching around e-cigarettes targeted at high schools, but also around other non-cigarette tobacco that allows us to still have a presence in schools without taking away instruction time.
Thinking only of the instructional time, you could always address policies, which I would assume that most schools, and certainly our school district in East Cleveland has a non-smoking policy, but looking at the materials, putting up posters and that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Something that could be done without taking away instruction.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have spoken on this before, but in Cuyahoga County, we are well aware that our cigar product rates far exceed our cigarette smoking rates, and almost all of the materials that are available focus on cigarette smoking. There are newer materials available about e-cigarettes, but in East Cleveland, in the city of Cleveland, and in many of our first-ring suburbs, if we don't have any of those materials about cigar products, we're just perpetuating the problem, because what many of these kids are starting on is not a traditional cigarette. And there's a real gap there in messaging for kids around the problems with these products. Mm-hmm. Yes?
For even if you go into like daycares and churches and organizations like that, so I wonder, is there any dialogue outside of like the policy information regarding the information given on the postcards and the posters to the people who are in charge of the organization? So for instance, like when you called the 211 line, and they had a different referral options to the community, leaders know about those options so they can be more vocal to the people who utilize the space, like within the daycares and everything, to kind of give more encouragement to call. So I'm thinking of, if I know that I can call, the 211 line to get information regarding how I can quit smoking, but maybe I don't know about, you mentioned 3 things that are free that they can go to.
Yeah.
Maybe if I knew about those before I called, I'll be more inclined to doing it.
Yeah.
Because the community leaders are there. If they knew about it, they could be more vocal, to the people who are in those spaces.
So as part of our communication with those organizations, we did try to explain that. In the materials that we posted, we tried to keep them short and sweet. So even in this palm card, it's very generic. Do you need help to quit smoking? But we felt that this was hopefully more inclusive than the Quitline messages, right? Like the tips from former smokers campaign exclusively says, call 1-800-QUIT-NOW, right? Well, we know from this that only 2/3 of those folks, there's another third of people who would never call that line. So right now we have a short message, and we're hoping that it's perceived as broader. But you're right, that may be an opportunity. I think my hope is that it would start to spread, but perhaps that's a great opportunity for us to think about how do we talk about what's available through 211 to kind of raise some more awareness about that. Thank you.
Can you try playing the ad?
I'm sorry?
Can you try playing the ad?
Yeah, let me,
Before people go ahead, it would be a...
yeah, let me see. Nori, did you have a question?
Well, just something nice like that, like you said, it's not scary, the one right there.
This one is a little scary.
I could see that being nice even in grade schools, because you want to reach those parents maybe who have a good reason to not want to be smoking around their grade school children.
Right,
And your
right.
parents, so you might reach them younger, and they might bring home these cards, and kids are usually pretty moldable too, I think, too. If you tell them just a little bit about it, they might really encourage their parents. Kind of
Yes.
like you see that with healthy foods and stuff.
Yes.
It's pretty healthy ideas.
So that's also why we worked with the libraries, because we knew that many of these libraries were places that the kids went after school, and that the parents were hopefully coming there as well. We just didn't have capacity to work with schools in this, but I think that's the natural go-to to find kids. In looking for other places that were more community-wide, but that were still family-focused, these were the most prevalent organizations within, or institutions within communities that would have some opportunity for that. I'm going to see if I can get this to play.
Martin. I'm using my 30 seconds of fame today to talk to you about smoking. I smoked for 43 years, and I know how hard it is to quit. 4 years ago, I made the choice to quit as a birthday present to myself. I wanted to ensure that I lived to see more birthdays. I know the struggles, so I'm urging you to call 211 today, the 24-hour helpline connecting you to resources that can help you quit. That's 211, the 24-hour helpline connecting you to the resources that can help you quit. It's time to breathe free.
Yes, sir.
I love that. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Any other questions?
Well, very good.
All right. Well, thank you so very much.